They say money hides pain better than love ever could. This is the story of a billionaire whose perfect world began to crack the night he brought his girlfriend home, long before anyone knew what she was really wearing around her neck. In a city built on ambition and polished lies, Ethan Harrington stood at the top. The 34-year-old tech magnate owned a skyline of smart towers and a brand that whispered luxury in every American household. Magazines called him the future of wealth. His mother, Margaret Harrington, called him her miracle. She'd lost almost everything decades ago: a husband, a fortune, and a child she never spoke of. What she rebuilt, she protected with iron grace. So when Ethan told her he'd found someone special, she smiled through nerves only a mother could hide. That evening, the Harrington mansion glowed like a diamond above the Hudson. Staff hurried, crystal gleamed, and Margaret rehearsed every word she'd say to the woman who might inherit the family name. When the limousine finally curved into the drive, Ethan stepped out first, his hand reaching for Lila Bennett, a poised art curator from Chicago. She moved with effortless elegance, the kind that came from old money or old wounds. Margaret's heartbeat quickened before she even knew why. There was something familiar about the girl, something in the way she carried herself, or in the faint glint beneath the scarf draped around her throat. Her smile faltered for half a second, but she said nothing. Not yet, because the night had only just begun. The grand dining room glittered like a scene from a luxury magazine. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across 12 feet of polished mahogany, and an orchestra's soft melody floated from hidden speakers. Margaret had planned this dinner for weeks, but nothing about it felt right. The moment Lila stepped into the room, a stillness crept in, a quiet, heavy silence that even wealth couldn't fill. Ethan, oblivious to the current under his mother's polite smile, poured wine and raised a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice warm and proud. Lila smiled gracefully. "To family," she replied. Margaret's glass paused midair. Family. The word lodged like a thorn in her chest. She glanced at the young woman. Perfect posture, elegant tone, but her eyes were different. Deep, searching, almost haunted. Between courses, Margaret studied her carefully. The way Lila's hand kept brushing the edge of the silk scarf around her neck, almost protectively. "Such a lovely accessory," Margaret said gently, trying to sound casual. "Is it vintage?" Lila hesitated. For a flicker of a second, her composure cracked. "It belonged to someone very dear to me," she whispered. Something cold stirred in Margaret's stomach. Ethan smiled proudly. "She never takes it off. Says it's her good luck charm." Margaret forced a smile, but her heart was pounding now, hard enough to feel in her throat. She'd seen that gesture before, decades ago, on someone she'd spent half her life trying to forget. The butler entered quietly to serve dessert, but Margaret barely noticed. All she could see was the faint outline of a heart-shaped pendant hidden beneath that silk. She couldn't prove it yet, but something deep inside her whispered the truth. That locket didn't just belong to Lila. It belonged to the past. Long after dinner ended, the Harrington mansion stood quiet under a blanket of city light. Ethan and Lila had retired to the terrace, laughing softly, their voices carried by the wind. But Margaret couldn't rest. Something about that girl, her timing, her charm, that necklace, refused to leave her mind. She walked through the dim hallway to her study, her heels echoing against marble floors. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Behind her desk sat a wall of framed family portraits, snapshots of a life that looked whole but wasn't. One photo, in particular, caught her gaze, a little girl in a summer dress, no older than 6, smiling beside a lake. Margaret's hand trembled as she touched the glass. The same locket glinted around the child's neck. Her breath hitched. It was impossible. That necklace had disappeared the night everything fell apart. The night she lost her husband and her daughter. She turned toward the window, her reflection staring back at her, pale and shaken. "No," she whispered to herself. "It can't be." Downstairs, Lila laughed again. A bright, warm sound that somehow made Margaret's skin crawl. She pulled out her phone and called the family's private investigator, James Weller. "James," she said, her voice low, steady. "I need you to find out everything about a woman named Lila Bennett. Chicago, early 30s. Art curator. I want her background, her family, every record you can find. Tonight." There was a pause. Is this about your son's girlfriend, ma'am? Margaret's eyes narrowed toward the terrace lights below. Ethan's silhouette leaned close to Lila's. This is about my family, she said coldly, and the truth that might destroy it. The next morning dawned over the city like gold on glass. The Harrington estate glowed beneath sunlight that caught on every window, but inside, the house was uneasy, too quiet, too still. Margaret sat in her breakfast solarium, the newspaper open before her, but unread. Her phone buzzed. James Weller had texted. Found something. Sending files now. Margaret opened the attachments. Public records, photographs, a few old addresses in Chicago. Lila Bennett's story seemed ordinary at first, until Margaret reached the last page. There it was. A birth certificate. Mother, Evelyn Cross. Father, unknown. Margaret's chest tightened. The name Evelyn Cross wasn't unfamiliar. It was the alias her late husband had used when he vanished for 6 months decades ago. Her teacup slipped slightly in her hand, rattling against the saucer. No, it couldn't be. Downstairs, Ethan and Lila were preparing to leave for a charity event. Lila wore a soft ivory dress, her scarf again draped elegantly at her neck. But as she glanced toward the grand staircase, she froze. Margaret stood at the top, watching her, not unkindly, but with a gaze that stripped away pretense. You remind me of someone, Margaret said gently. Lila smiled politely. People say that sometimes. Margaret's lips curved in a ghost of a smile. I doubt they know who. The silence lingered. For the first time, Lila felt unsettled, as though the mansion itself held memories she couldn't see but somehow belonged to. That evening, while Ethan changed upstairs, Lila wandered alone through the hallways. She stopped before a portrait, a man with familiar eyes and a smile that mirrored her own. She touched the frame, whispering, "Who were you?" And somewhere above her, unseen, Margaret watched from the balcony, her doubts now turning into dread. Night returned to the Harrington mansion like a storm without thunder. The city glittered beyond the hills, but inside the house, Margaret's world grew smaller by the minute. James Weller's name flashed across her phone again. Ma'am, I found something strange about the necklace. Margaret's pulse quickened. Tell me. It's not just any locket. It was custom-made, 34 years ago, commissioned by a man named Richard Harrington. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her late husband. And there's more, Weller continued. It was engraved on the inside with 2 initials, MH and EH. Margaret gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. MH, Margaret Harrington. EH, Evelyn Harrington. Her daughter. The child she'd lost in a car explosion decades ago, the one police said had perished before her eyes. Margaret's breath caught. The same locket she buried with that tiny casket now rested against Lila Bennett's skin. But how? Downstairs, laughter echoed from the sitting room. Lila and Ethan were curled up on the couch, flipping through photos of future wedding venues. Lila's scarf slipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of the gold chain. Margaret stood in the doorway, unseen, her heart splitting between horror and hope. She wanted to rip that necklace off and see the engraving herself, but fear held her frozen. If it was real, what did that make Lila? Later that night, unable to sleep, Margaret crept into Ethan's office and pulled up Weller's file on the big screen. Under Adoption Record Inquiry, one line blinked. Infant female, found abandoned, Chicago, 1992. Margaret's shaking hand hovered over the photo attached. It was Lila, her son's fiancée, and possibly her daughter. The ballroom of the Harrington Foundation Gala shimmered like a jewelry box spilled open, crystal chandeliers, velvet gowns, the hum of old money and new ambition. Cameras flashed as Ethan and Lila arrived arm in arm, the city's power brokers applauding the perfect couple. Margaret followed a few steps behind, poised but pale. Her diamond bracelet caught the light, yet her eyes never left the locket peeking beneath Lila's scarf. All evening she rehearsed what she'd say, how she'd ask without trembling. But the words tangled with memories, Richard's laughter, Evelyn's tiny hands, the fire, the coffin that had felt too light. When the orchestra paused for speeches, Ethan lifted the microphone. Tonight's about legacy, he said proudly. My parents built this dream, and I'm honored to continue it, with Lila by my side. Applause swelled. Lila blushed. Margaret's chest tightened. Legacy. That word again. As guests turned back to their champagne, Margaret crossed the marble floor, her heels clicking like a heartbeat. "Lila," she said softly. Lila turned, smiling. "Mrs. Harrington." "Please," Margaret interrupted, her voice trembling. "May I see what's under your scarf?" Conversations nearby dimmed. Even Ethan looked puzzled. Lila blinked. "It's just a locket." Margaret's hand shook. "Please." Slowly, Lila untied the silk. The small gold heart caught the chandelier's light. Margaret reached out, fingers grazing the metal, and with a whisper, the clasp sprang open. Inside, two faded initials gleamed, MH/EH. The room seemed to tilt. Margaret's breath hitched, her glass slipped, and the world blurred into a single gasp. "Evelyn," she murmured. Then darkness folded around her, and the billionaire's mother crumpled to the marble floor as the orchestra's music shattered into silence. The rhythmic beep of hospital machines cut through the hush of the private suite. Outside, dawn spilled over Manhattan's skyline, washing the glass towers in pale gold. Margaret stirred, eyes fluttering open to sterile white and the faint scent of lilies. Her first thought wasn't pain. It was the image of the locket gleaming in her hand. Across the room, Ethan sat motionless in a designer chair, his suit wrinkled, his eyes red. "Mom," he breathed, relief and confusion tangled together. "You scared us." She tried to sit, wincing. "How long?" "Since last night." He hesitated. "The doctors said it was shock. They don't know why, but I think I do." Margaret looked away. The truth sat heavy on her tongue, impossible to swallow and unbearable to speak. "Who is she, Mom?" Ethan's voice cracked. "What happened out there? Why did you faint when you saw her necklace?" She closed her eyes. "Because it once belonged to someone I buried." Silence. Only the steady hum of machines. Ethan leaned forward. "Buried." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for his. "Before you were born, there was another child. A sister. Evelyn. The car crash. They said she died. But that locket." "Ethan, I buried that locket with her." His breath left him in a single, stunned exhale. "You think Lila is?" "I don't know," Margaret whispered. "But I need to find out before this family loses itself again." Just then, the door opened. Lila stood in the doorway, pale, the locket still around her neck. Her eyes met Margaret's, terrified, questioning, and somehow familiar. The room fell still, because in that instant, all three of them realized the past hadn't stayed buried after all. The Harrington penthouse had never felt so small. Its floor-to-ceiling windows opened to $1 million skyline, but every reflection in the glass seemed to ask the same question. What if it's true? Lila sat at the marble kitchen island, the locket resting beside a half-empty cup of tea. Ethan stood by the window, his back rigid, the city lights flickering across his suit. Margaret moved slowly between them, the weight of 40 years pressing on her shoulders. "I ordered a DNA test," Ethan said quietly. "The lab will send someone tonight." Lila nodded, voice small. "I understand." Margaret wanted to comfort her, but fear kept her frozen. She didn't know whether to embrace this woman or keep her at arm's length until the truth was carved in science. While they waited, Lila spoke. "I grew up in Chicago. My mother, Evelyn Cross, never talked about my father. She used to cry at night and hold this locket like it was the only thing keeping her alive." Margaret's eyes filled. She survived?" Lila looked down. "She died when I was 6. House fire. I was pulled out by a neighbor. Everything else burned." The memory made her voice quiver. "I always wondered why she made me promise never to sell this locket. She said one day, someone might need it to remember who I was." The room went still again. Ethan rubbed his temples. "If the test confirms this, it changes everything. Our family name, the company, our lives." Margaret reached out, touching Lila's hand. "Sweetheart, it doesn't change you. You've already brought back something I thought was gone forever." Before Lila could answer, the doorbell rang. The courier had arrived, and with it, the truth. Hours later, the courier returned with a sealed envelope. Thin, white, ordinary, yet heavier than gold. They gathered in the living room beneath the grand chandelier, the city humming far below. Ethan held the envelope but couldn't open it. "Mom," he said softly, "you should do it." Margaret's hands shook as she tore the seal. She unfolded the paper, eyes scanning the black lines that would decide everything. A breath caught in her throat. "Positive," she whispered. "Lila Bennett, biological daughter of Richard and Margaret Harrington." For a heartbeat, none of them moved. The world seemed to stop. Then Ethan exhaled, a sound half laughter, half sob. "You're my sister," he murmured, disbelief and relief crashing together. Lila pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling over. All those years of not knowing, of wondering where she came from, it all led here. Margaret crossed the room, her strength breaking as she pulled Lila into her arms. "My baby," she cried. "I thought I lost you forever." Lila clung to her, shaking. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "I know, sweetheart. None of it was your fault." Ethan turned away, struggling with the swirl of joy and loss. The woman he loved had become his sister, his family reborn through heartbreak. He whispered, "Maybe some things are meant to find their way back, no matter how far they go." For the first time, Margaret smiled through tears. The mansion that once echoed with grief felt alive again, filled with something money could never buy, truth. But as Lila glanced toward the window, her smile faded. Across the street, a black car idled. Inside, a shadowed figure lowered his phone after snapping a photo of the reunion. The past, it seemed, still wasn't done with the Harringtons. Rain swept across Manhattan the next morning, turning the Harrington mansion's windows into sheets of silver. Inside, the fire crackled, and the air felt lighter, as if the storm outside had taken years of secrets with it. Margaret stood near the piano, a photo album open on the polished lid. Every picture told the story of a family lost and somehow found again. Beside her, Lila traced a faded snapshot of a little girl by a lake. "That's me," she whispered. Margaret smiled through tears. "That's us." Ethan entered quietly, his tie loosened, the sleepless night still in his eyes. "Board's waiting for me," he said. "They want to know if the company name changes now that there's another Harrington heir." Margaret looked at her children, one by birthright, one by miracle. "Tell them the name stays. But remind them what it means. Harrington should stand for family before fortune." Lila nodded. "I'd like to help, with the foundation. Maybe rebuild the children's homes Mom started years ago." Ethan smiled. "You're already part of it." Outside, thunder rolled, then faded into a clear blue hush. For the first time in decades, the house felt like a home again, not a museum of memories, but a place where new ones could grow. Margaret closed the album and whispered, "Your father always said love finds its way back." He was right. As they embraced, the camera of the man in the black car clicked once more before he drove away, vanishing into traffic, his photo already uploading to a private file labeled Harrington Estate. Reopened case. Inside, laughter rose over the ring. Whatever waited beyond those gates, they would face it together. Because this time, the Harringtons were whole.